To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. That it has frequently, very frequently, so fallen can scarcely be denied. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? We know that there are diseases in which occur total cessations of all apparent functions of vitality, and yet in which these cessations are merely suspensions, properly so called. They are only temporary pauses in the incomprehensible mechanism. A certain period elapses, and some unseen, mysterious principle again sets the motion of the magic pinions and the wizard wheels. The silver cord was not forever loosed, nor the golden bowl irreparably broken. But where, meantime, was the soul? It may be asserted without hesitation that no event is so terribly well adapted to inspire the supremeness of bodily and mental distress as is burial before death. The unendurable oppression of the lungs, the stifling fumes from the damp earth, the clinging to the death garments, the rigid embrace of the narrow house, the blackness of the absolute night, the silence like in a sea that overwhelms, the unseen but palpable presence of the conqueror worm. We know of nothing so agonizing upon earth. We can dream of nothing half so hideous in the realms of the nethermost hell. What I have now to tell you is of my own actual knowledge, of my own positive and personal experience. For several years, I had been subject to attacks of the singular disorder which physicians have agreed to term catalepsy, in default of a more definitive title. Although both the immediate and the predisposing causes and even the actual diagnosis of this disease are still mysterious, its obvious and apparent character is sufficiently well understood. Its variations seem to be chiefly of degree. Sometimes the patient lies for a day only, or even for a shorter period, in a species of exaggerated lethargy. He is senseless and extremely motionless, but the pulsation of the heart is still faintly perceptible. Some traces of warmth remain. A slight color lingers within the center of the cheek. And upon the application of a mirror to the lips, we can detect a torpid, unequal, and vacillating action of the lungs. Then again, the duration of the trance is for weeks, even for months, while the closest scrutiny and the most rigorous medical tests fail to establish any material distinction between the state of the sufferer and what we conceive of as absolute death. Very usually, he is saved from premature interment solely by the knowledge of his friends that he has been previously subject to catalepsy. My own case differed in no important particular from those mentioned in medical books. Sometimes, without any apparent cause, I sank little by little into a condition of hemisyncope or half-swoon. And in this condition, without pain, without ability to stir or, strictly speaking, to think, but with a dull, lethargic consciousness of life and of the presence of those who surrounded my bed, I remained until the crisis of the disease restored me, suddenly, to perfect sensation. I was quickly and impetuously smitten. I grew sick and numb and chilly and dizzy and fell prostrate at once. Then, for weeks, all was void and black and silent, and nothing became the universe. Total annihilation could be no more. From these latter attacks I awoke, however, with a gradation slow in proportion to the suddenness of the seizure. In all that I endured, there was no physical suffering, but of moral distress and infinitude. My fancy grew charnel. I talked of worms, of tombs, and epitaphs. I was lost in reveries of death, and the idea of premature burial held continual possession of my brain. The ghastly danger to which I was subject haunted me day and night. In the former, the torture of meditation was excessive. In the latter, supreme. When the grim darkness overspread the earth, then, with every horror of thought, I shook as the quivering plumes upon the hearse. When nature could endure wakefulness no longer, it was with a struggle that I consented to sleep, for I shuddered to reflect that upon awakening I might find myself the tenant of a grave. My nerves became thoroughly unstrung, and I fell to prey to perpetual horror. I hesitated to ride or to walk or to indulge in any exercise that would carry me from my home. In fact, I no longer dared trust myself out of the immediate presence of those who were aware of my proneness to catalepsy, lest, falling into one of my usual fits, I should be buried before my real condition could be ascertained. I entered into a series of elaborate precautions. Among other things, I had the family vault so remodeled as to admit being readily opened from within. The slightest pressure upon a long lever that extended far into the tomb would cause the iron portal to fly back. The coffin intended for my reception was warmly and softly padded and was provided with a lid fashioned upon a principle of the vault door, with the addition of springs, so contrived that the feeblest movement of the body would be sufficient to set it at liberty. Besides all this, there was suspended from the roof of the tomb a large bell, the rope of which, it was designed, should extend through a hole in the coffin, and so be fastened to one of the hands of the corpse. There arrived an epoch, as often before there had arrived, in which I found myself emerging from total unconsciousness into the first feeble, indefinite sense of existence, slowly, with a tortoise gradation, approached with the faint gray dawn of the physical day, a torpid uneasiness, an apathetic endurance of dull pain. Then, after a long interval, a ringing in the ears. Then, after a lapse of still longer, a prickling or tingling sensation in the extremities. At length, the slight quivering of an eyelid, and immediately thereupon, an electric shock of terror, deadly and indefinite, which sends the blood in torrents from the temples to the heart. And now, the first positive effort to think. And now, the first endeavor to remember. I feel that I am not awakening from an ordinary sleep. I recollect that I have been subject to catalepsy. And now at last, as if by the rush of an ocean, my shuddering spirit is overwhelmed by one grim danger, by the one spectral and ever-prevalent idea. For some minutes after this fancy prepossessed me, I remained without motion. And why? I could not summon the courage to move. I dare not make the effort which was to satisfy me of my fate. And yet there was something in my heart which whispered me it was sure. Despair, such as no other species of wretchedness ever calls into being. Despair alone urged me, after long irresolution, to uplift the heavy lids of my eyes. I uplifted them. It was dark, all dark. I knew that the fit was over. I knew that the crisis of my disorder had long passed. I knew that I now fully recovered the use of my visual faculties. And yet it was dark, all dark, the intense and utter raylessness of the night that endureth forevermore. I endeavored to shriek. My lips and my parched tongue moved convulsively together in the attempt, but no voice issued from the cavernous lungs, which oppressed as if by the weight of some incumbent mountain, gasped and palpitated with the heart at every elaborate and struggling inspiration. The movement of the jaws in this effort to cry aloud showed me that they were bound up, as is usual with the dead. I felt, too, that I lay upon some hard substance, and by something similar my sides were also closely compressed. So far, I had not ventured to stir any of my limbs, but now I violently threw up my arms, which had been lying at length with the wrists crossed. They struck a solid wooden substance which extended above my person at an elevation of not more than 6 inches from my face. I could no longer doubt that I reposed within a coffin at last. And now, amid all my infinite miseries, came sweetly the cherub hope. For I thought of my precautions. I writhed and made spasmodic exertions to force open the lid. It would not move. I felt my wrists for the bell rope. It was not to be found. And now the comforter fled forever, and a still sterner despair reigned triumphant, for I could not help perceiving the absence of the paddings which I had so carefully prepared. And then, too, there came suddenly to my nostrils the strong, peculiar odor of moist earth. The conclusion was irresistible. I was not within the vault. I had fallen into a trance while absent from home, while among strangers. When or how, I could not remember. But it was they who had buried me as a dog, nailed up in some common coffin and thrust deep, deep and forever into some ordinary, nameless grave. As this awful conviction forced itself thus into my innermost chambers of my soul, I once again struggled to cry aloud, and in this second endeavor I succeeded. A long, wild, continuous shriek or yell of agony resounded through the realms of the subterranean night. "Hello! Hello there!" said a gruff voice in reply. "What the devil's the matter now?" said a second. "Get out of that," said a third. "What do you mean by yowling in that there kind of style, like a catamount?" said a fourth. And hereupon I was seized and shaken without ceremony for several minutes by a junto of very rough-looking individuals. They did not arouse me from my slumber, for I was wide awake when I screamed, but they restored me to the full possession of my memory. This adventure occurred near Richmond in Virginia. Accompanied by a friend, I had proceeded upon a gunning expedition, some miles down the banks of the James River. Night approached, and we were overtaken by a storm. The cabin of a small sloop, lying at anchor in the stream and laden with garden mold, afforded us the only available shelter. We made the best of it and passed the night on board. I slept in one of the only 2 berths in the vessel, and the berths in a sloop of 60 or 20 tons need scarcely be described. That which I occupied had no bedding of any kind. Its extreme width was 18 inches. The distance of its bottom from the deck overhead was precisely the same. I found it a matter of exceeding difficulty to squeeze myself in. Nevertheless, I slept soundly, and the whole of my vision, for it was no dream and no nightmare, arose naturally from the circumstances of my position, from my ordinary bias of thought, and from the difficulty to which I have alluded of collecting my senses, and especially of regaining my memory for a long time after awakening from a slumber. The men who shook me with a crew of the sloop and some laborers engaged to unload it. From the load itself came the earthy smell. The bondage about my jaws was a silk handkerchief in which I had bound up my head in default of my customary nightcap. The tortures endured, however, were indubitably quite equal for the time to those of actual sepulture. They were inconceivably hideous. But out of evil proceeded good, for their very excess wrought in my spirit an inevitable revulsion. My soul acquired tone, acquired temper. I went abroad, I took vigorous exercise. I breathed the free air of heaven. I thought upon other subjects than death. I discarded my medical books and bugaboo tales, such as this. I became a new man and lived a man's life. From that memorable night, I dismissed forever my charnel apprehensions, and with them vanished the cataleptic disorder, of which perhaps they had been less the consequence than the cause. There are moments when, even to the sober eye of reason, the world of our sad humanity may assume the semblance of a hell. But the imagination of man is no Carathis to explore with impunity its every cavern. Alas, the grim legion of sepulchral terrors cannot be regarded as altogether fanciful, but like the demons in whose company Ephraim made his voyage down the Oxus, they must sleep, or they will devour us. They must be suffered to slumber, or we perish.